So the YouTube user Sargon of Akkad has recently made a video entitled "Why Do Black People Commit More Crime?", in which he looks to poverty, family structure, and gang culture to explain the high rates of crime seen among African Americans. In Sargon's video, he correctly points out that African Americans commit more crime than members of other races do, and that the same is true of poor people and people from single-parent homes. Moreover, blacks are far more likely to be poor and to be from single-parent homes, and so Sargon argues that these variables plausibly explain why it is that blacks have such high crime rates. Now, that explanation is obviously somewhat simplistic. If you want a better idea of what he says, go watch his video, which you should do anyhow if you're listening to a response to it. It's true that poverty and family structure correlate with crime. However, neither has been shown to cause crime, and a non-causal relationship between crime and these variables is suggested by the fact that changes in the degree to which a population is poor, or the degree to which it has single mothers, over time does not predict changes in the degree to which that population has crime. So for instance, looking at the last 50 years of American history, we can see that crime actually tended to decrease when the poverty rate increased. This evidence fits well with a review of 28 studies in the Handbook of Crime Correlates, which found that the majority of studies showed that crime actually rises when the economy improves. Thus, most of the longitudinal data available does not support the notion that poverty causes crime. When people become poorer, crime does not rise, and this suggests that the correlation between poverty and crime is best explained by the view that there is a certain segment of the population which tends to be poor and criminal, not because one variable causes the other, but rather because some other variable, or set of variables, causes people to be both poor and criminal. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of much high-quality data on the longitudinal relationship between family structure and crime. However, if we look at how these two variables changed between 1960 and 2009, we clearly do not see strong support for a causal relationship. Now, in order to address this lack of good evidence, I, along with Martin Alexander of the blog Of Psych and Society, analyzed data from the FBI and the census on how violent crime, family structure, poverty, and racial demographics changed in 197 American cities between the years 2006 and 2014. And as can be seen, changes in the proportion of a city that was black was the only significant predictor of changes in violent crime. Moreover, both single motherhood and poverty were negatively correlated with violent crime over time, meaning that they tended to decrease when crime rose, and they tended to rise when crime fell. Thus, the relevant longitudinal evidence does not support the contention that differences in family structure or poverty caused differences in violent crime. And even if these variables did cause crime, they could not explain the totality of the black-white crime gap. And this is something we know because the proportion of a city which is black continues to predict its crime rate even after differences in family structure and poverty are controlled for. So for instance, a study from 1990 collected data on homicide rates of cities, standard metropolitan areas, and states for the years 1960, 1970, and 1980. In each year, they included all 50 states and every city and standard metropolitan area included in the census. They then looked at how well the following 11 variables predicted crime variation between these areas: population size, population density, percent black, percent aged between 15 and 29, percent divorced, percent of kids without two parents, median family income, the poverty rate, income inequality, the unemployment rate, and whether or not the city, metropolitan area, or state was in the South. All of these variables were entered into a single regression model at once, meaning that the estimated effect size for each variable held all other 10 variables constant. This analysis therefore produced 9 total models explaining crime in cities, standard metropolitan areas, and states across 3 decades. In all but one model, the proportion of an area that was black continued to have a strong relationship with crime even after the other 10 variables in the study were held constant. Another study analyzed crime variation across 2,078 U.S. counties and found that the proportion of a county that was black continued to predict its crime rate even after controlling for county differences in poverty, divorce rates, income inequality, religiosity, population density, age, and education. Now, I can add to this literature 2 more analyses that I recently did, again with help from Martin Alexander of Psych and Society. So in the first analysis, using data from the census and the FBI, we looked at racial demographics, violent crime, poverty, education levels, and family structure in 306 American cities for the year 2014. Violent crime rates were put through a log transformation to correct for non-normality, and the percent of a city that was black continued to predict its violent crime rate after holding poverty, education, and family structure constant. Similarly, in the second analysis of 231 American cities in the year 2006, we found that the proportion of a city that was black continued to predict its crime rate even after controlling for city differences in poverty, education, and family structure. In both models, the introduction of these multivariate controls reduced the bivariate relationship between percent black and violent crime by about half. Some people might interpret this to suggest that half of the black-white crime gap can be causally explained by single parenthood and poverty, but this would not be a correct interpretation. Percent black's association with crime may be reduced by controlling for poverty and single motherhood because these variables cause crime, because these variables are caused by crime, or because blacks tend to be poor, criminal, and from single-parent homes due to some confounding variable. Thus, these analyses only provide us with an estimate of the maximum proportion of the relationship between race and crime which is attributable to single parenthood and poverty, and that maximum is half. Another source of evidence of this comes from the relationship between racial differences in wealth and crime over time. Over the 20th century, the black-white wage gap has lessened while the black-white crime gap has widened. Finally, a study looked at how crime varied among individuals of different races and varying amounts of net wealth. And as can be seen, the results of this analysis also cast serious doubt on the idea that poverty can explain racial crime gaps. Now, given the uniformity of these results across several different analyses, I think we can say with a reasonable degree of confidence that a very significant proportion of the relationship between race and crime cannot be explained by poverty or family structure. Now, Sargon also talks about gangs as a cause of black crime rates. Here we can find some agreement. It is almost certainly true that blacks would be less criminal if they were not involved in gangs. However, this proposition naturally leads us to wonder why it is that blacks are so involved with gangs in the first place. Now, Sargon would likely say that this has to do with poverty and family structure, but as we've already seen, these variables cannot explain the black-white crime gap. It would also be reasonable for us to wonder why it is that blacks are so much more likely to have children outside of marriage and to be poor. Neither of these facts about American life are new, nor are they exclusively American. The same can be said of crime. If we look back in American history, we can see that, relative to African Americans, whites have always, though to varying degrees, been richer, less likely to have children outside of wedlock, and less likely to be criminal. This mirrors what we see around the world. Black nations have higher rates of both crime and poverty than white and East Asian nations do. For instance, here are the numbers for 2002, and here are numbers I pulled from the World Bank for 2014. Similarly, African nations have the highest rates of single parenthood. So in my view, there's an explanation for all three of these patterns. Why it is the blacks around the world, and for as long as we have data, have always been poor, more likely to have single parenthoods, and more likely to be criminal. And this alternative hypothesis is that for partially genetic reasons, blacks are more likely than whites to exhibit various personality traits, which in turn causes them to have high rates of crime, poverty, and single parenthood. Now, those unfamiliar with behavioral genetics may be surprised by such an explanation because they are uncomfortable with the idea that behavioral differences between people have a genetic basis. However, twin studies done over several decades have shown that variation in virtually all human traits are partly caused by genetics. Traits studied in these studies include criminality, income, and family structure. And as we can see, there's evidence to suggest that the majority of variation in violent criminality is caused by genes. Others will be uneasy with the idea that there are genetic differences between the races. We all recognize genetic differences in non-mental traits such as height and skin color, but for political reasons we resist applying the same thinking to mental traits. Now, of course, evolution does not care about this political thinking, and moreover, this inconsistency is made even more problematic by the fact that the genes which differ between the races the most are involved in the brain. So with that being said, let's start with racial differences in personality traits and then work our way back to genes. The personality trait most obviously associated with crime is aggression, and there are several lines of evidence suggesting that blacks are more aggressive than whites. Firstly, blacks are more likely than whites to get into fights at school. Secondly, blacks are more likely than whites to bully people at school. And thirdly, the more violent a crime is, the more heavily African Americans tend to be overrepresented in it. Thus, there is good reason to think that blacks are more aggressive than whites are. Blacks are also more impulsive than whites are. Self-control is experimentally measured by having people choose between a reward they can get now and a larger reward they can get later. People who choose to receive a larger reward later are shown to have a greater ability to delay gratification, and so more self-control. Self-control has been shown to correlate with poverty and criminality even after controlling for IQ and parental socioeconomic status. And moreover, as detailed in the text version of this video, racial differences in self-control have been shown to exist in many studies. These studies have taken place all over the world, and they've been done in children and in adults, and these differences persist if you control for socioeconomic status. And these differences likely contribute to racial differences in crime, poverty, and non-marital birth rates. Now, some people may note that Sargon cited a study, the Edinburgh Study of Youth Transitions in Crime, which claimed to find an association between poverty and crime even after controlling for differences in impulsivity. This in turn may be taken as evidence against my view that self-control significantly confounds the relationship between poverty and crime. So there are 4 things to say about this. First, it's only one study. Second, it utilized a self-report measure of self-control, and there is obviously a problem with social desirability bias in asking people questions like the degree to which they agree with, quote, I sometimes break rules because I do things without thinking. Thirdly, several items on this scale do not obviously relate to time preference for immediate rewards over future ones, which is the notion of self-control that is used in most of the studies which I cited. And given this, individuals may be equal in their scores on the scale, but differ in time preference. And finally, even if it is true that poverty correlates with crime independently of self-control, the fact that self-control does not explain all of the association between poverty and crime does not imply that it doesn't explain some, or even most of it. Blacks also score higher than whites on measures of psychopathic personality. So for instance, consider the psychopathic deviant scale. This scale was constructed by giving a bunch of questions to 2 groups of people. One, a group of people who were thought to exhibit psychopathy, and then 2, a group of people who were normal. And in picking the questions that best differentiated those 2 groups to be included in the scale. People who score high on the scale are said to be irresponsible, antisocial, aggressive, having recurrent marital and work problems, and underachieving. This scale has also been shown to predict criminality. So several reviews have concluded that all around the world, blacks score higher than whites and Asians on this scale of psychopathic personality. There's been disagreement about whether or not these differences are practically significant, though everyone agrees they are statistically significant. However, whether or not this difference on its own is of practical significance tells us nothing about whether or not it is one of the many factors which contributes to racial crime disparities. Furthermore, all the samples used in these meta-analyses were either clinical or correctional in nature, and because of this, the reported mean differences in these studies may be significantly less than what would be found if the sample were taken from the general population. In sum, differences in psychopathic personality likely make some contribution to racial differences in crime, poverty, and non-marital birth rates. Another feature shared by both blacks and criminals is low levels of stress. Criminologists have explained the association between low levels of stress and crime by positing that many people would be deterred from committing a crime even if they wanted to by the level of anxiety, stress, and nervousness that attempting to commit said crime would cause, which is why having a less active stress response would predispose people towards criminality. Having a slow heartbeat and a low level of the hormone cortisol are both biological markers of this phenomena, which have been independently linked to criminality and shown to be more common among blacks than among whites. And black people also self-report being less stressed than white people do. So in conclusion, several aspects of black personality, including higher levels of aggression, impulsivity, and psychopathy, as well as lower levels of stress, likely predispose them towards crime. So now that we have looked at the personality traits, let's start working our way back towards biology and genes. We've already seen that the hormone cortisol may play a role in racial crime differences. Blacks have lower levels of cortisol, and this in turn makes them have a lessened biological stress response. Low levels of cortisol may also predispose blacks towards crime because cortisol blocks the action of the hormone testosterone. Having less cortisol means that testosterone will be more active in blacks. Testosterone activity has been linked many times to aggression and crime. Meta-analyses show that testosterone is correlated with aggression in human and non-human animals. Women who suffer from a disease known as congenital adrenal hyperplasia are exposed to abnormally high amounts of testosterone and are abnormally aggressive. Artificially increasing the amount of testosterone in a person's blood has been shown to lead to increases in aggression. In fact, injecting rhesus monkeys, who are female, with testosterone in the womb increases their aggression such that they act just like young males do. And people in prison have much higher rates of testosterone than normal. Thus, testosterone seems to cause aggression and crime. So to return to race, a 2014 meta-analysis of 14 studies found that blacks have higher levels of free-floating testosterone in their blood than whites do, and so testosterone and cortisol's interaction with testosterone likely contributes to black crime rates. But exacerbating this problem even further is the fact that blacks are more likely than whites to have a low repeat version of the androgen receptor gene. The androgen receptor gene codes for a receptor called the androgen receptor, which reacts to hormones, androgen hormones, like testosterone. This receptor is a key part of the mechanism by which testosterone has its effects throughout the body and brain. Now, all versions of this gene have several repeats of a CAG or CAG nucleotide sequence. Variants between people differ in their number of these repeats. Versions of this gene with fewer average numbers of repeats lead to increased androgen activity, and as I detail in the text version of this video, such alleles have been associated many times with crime and aggression. And they have also been associated with growing up in single-parent homes. And 4 separate studies have shown that low repeat alleles of the AR gene are more common among blacks than among whites. Given this, it is highly likely that low repeat AR alleles increase black crime rates by increasing the impact of testosterone. Due to testosterone's impact on sexuality, these same mechanisms may also explain why blacks have such high rates of single parenthood. Now to move on to another gene, the best established gene related to crime in the entire literature of the behavioral genetics of crime is the gene for monoamine oxidase A, which is called the MAOA gene. And this gene has been shown to be involved in crime, aggression, and impulsivity, and it's known to differ racially. So the MAOA gene produces an enzyme which is also called monoamine oxidase A, and this enzyme breaks down a class of neurotransmitters called monoamines in the brain. The way it does that is by oxidation, hence monoamine oxidase. And there are 2 of them, so A, the other one is monoamine oxidase B. But anyway, these neurotransmitters include ones that we all know to affect behavior, such as dopamine and serotonin, things you hear about in the news and such. And some versions of the MAOA gene lead to lower levels of production of the MAOA enzyme. That leads to increased monoamine activity in the brain. The molecular difference between different versions of the MAOA gene lies in the number of times a certain section of its promoter region is repeated. 3 repeat alleles lead to lower than average levels of the enzyme MAOA, and the 2 repeat allele leads to extremely low levels of MAOA. So beginning in the 1990s, researchers started to suspect that variation in MAOA levels may be related to traits like aggression and criminal behavior, following the discovery of a family which had a mutation which caused exceptionally unheard of low levels of this enzyme. And this single family also included rapists and arsonists and other violent criminals. And so that stood out quite a good deal. So later, geneticists raised rats with an artificial version of the MAOA gene, which led to low levels of the MAOA enzyme. And this was found to cause the rats to act more aggressive than is typical. That was first found in 1995, but has been replicated several times since. So the first direct link between the MAOA alleles and violence in humans came from a study conducted in 2002. A very famous study in the molecular genetics of behavior, by the way. This research found that people with either the 2 or 3R version of the allele of the MAOA gene tended to be more aggressive than average, but only if they had difficult upbringings. So based on these results, it was hypothesized that low-activity MAOA genes might cause people to have stronger reactions to negative experiences than people with high-activity versions of the gene. Since then, a meta-analysis has confirmed that this interaction between MAOA genotype and childhood trauma has been well replicated in male subjects. A lot of the research on the MAOA gene and the AR gene, by the way, are involved in primarily males because the MAOA gene is on the X chromosome and androgen receptor gene, obviously. Males have very different levels of testosterone than women do. Men are also the people that commit almost all the crime, so it works out well in this context. So over time, researchers have found that the low-activity MAOA allele predicts higher levels of antisocial personality. Regardless of child abuse, it has what is called a main effect, along with the previously cited interaction effect. These versions of this gene have also been linked to high levels of credit card debt and obesity, and low-activity versions of this gene have been shown to significantly increase the risk that someone will end up in prison. So when I look at those traits, a gene that causes differences in dopamine, which is well known to be involved in impulsivity, and versions of the gene which lead to more dopamine activity are associated with high levels of crime and obesity and credit card debt. The common personality factor behind those things seems to me most likely to in fact be self-control. Now finally, multiple studies have shown that the races differ in the frequency of both low expression MAOA alleles. Blacks are far more likely than whites to possess the 2R and 3R allele. And this difference constitutes strong evidence that genetics plays a role in racial differences in aggression, self-control, and crime. And racial differences in IQ-related genes are also relevant here because there is a genetic correlation between IQ and self-control, meaning that the same genes which explain variation in self-control also explain variation in IQ. Moreover, self-control and IQ are positively correlated. In conjunction, these facts should lead us to suspect that genes which predispose people towards low IQ will often also predispose them towards low self-control. Now, 2015 saw the first major attempt to compare the frequency of IQ-related genes across the races, and it found that for every gene examined, whites were more likely than blacks to possess the allele associated with higher intelligence. Given this, it seems likely that the genes which predispose blacks towards low IQ also predisposes them towards low self-control, which in turn predisposes them towards crime, poverty, and single parenthood. Now, to be clear, it is not my view that genes explain the entirety of the black-white gap. Environmental variables, such as lead exposure and child abuse rates, likely play a role too, although blacks having higher levels of child abuse and lead exposure, that itself I think probably has a genetic component. But I think there's good reason to think that genes are the most important factor in explaining this. And that is because a genetic explanation has the benefit of offering an extremely parsimonious explanation for a wide range of data. Racial differences in crime are seen all around the world. As noted earlier, black nations have higher crime rates than European nations do, but moreover, official crime rate statistics have replicated the African white crime disparity in many nations all over the earth. So for instance, Canada, Britain, Australia, France, Israel, Brazil, and Japan. The racial crime gap is also known to start early in life, so you look at juvenile arrest rates, you see basically what we see among adults. Getting in trouble in school has certain similarities to getting in trouble with the police. Both involve defying authority, breaking rules, and often violence, and the Department of Education has released many reports showing that blacks are far more likely than whites to get in trouble in school as early as preschool. And of course, as I already talked about, in school blacks are more likely to fight, they're more likely to bully. As I also mentioned earlier, the racial crime gap has existed for a long time. In fact, it shows up in studies using data from the 19th century. So the general picture here of something that is true of blacks here and on the other side of the world, and is true of blacks now and 100 years ago, that fits a genetic explanation pretty well. It's hard to see how a cultural difference could cause something that follows a population around time and geography like that, unless, of course, this cultural difference itself had a genetic origin. And it is very hard to think of a more parsimonious explanation for black crime. And this is especially true, given that the genetic evidence that I went over here makes total egalitarianism about race and crime not really a reasonable position to take. This hypothesis that blacks are genetically predisposed towards violence and low self-control, this also explains why poverty and weak families are present among Africans all over the world. And it also explains why people don't become more criminal when the economy tanks. The economy tanking doesn't magically change people's character, but there will always be an aggressive and impulsive fraction of society which, due to these personality traits, they tend to be poor and having children outside of wedlock, and criminal. And so this segment of the population will cause there to be cross-sectional correlations between single parenthood, poverty, and crime. So this explanation really can explain all of the data that we've looked at here, which is a very impressive level of parsimony. So, in conclusion, or in summary, I don't think that poverty and family structure play a huge role in racial crime differences, or crime in general for that matter. And even if they do play some role, a large difference remains when their influence is statistically controlled for, and that is an estimate of the largest possible contribution that poverty and family structure can have on crime. The immediate cause of racial differences in crime significantly consists of racial differences in aggression, anxiety, and self-control. These differences in turn are probably partially caused by genetic differences between blacks and whites. Other environmental variables are likely involved as well, but this has concentrated on the genetic causes, both because I think they're the most important and because they are the most often ignored.